The bar was loud, smoky, and dangerous, the kind of place where no one dared look the wrong way at the wrong man. And yet, a young waitress leaned forward, placed his drink down, and said words that froze the Mafia boss mid-breath. "My mother has a ring just like yours." In that instant, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the music, everything went silent. The boss's hand stopped halfway to his glass, and his cold eyes locked onto hers. No one in the bar dared to move. Who was this girl? And how could her family possibly have something that belonged only to him? Stay with me until the end, because what followed would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Maria Santos had been working at the Golden Eagle for 3 years. It wasn't the kind of establishment you'd find in tourist guides. Tucked away in the shadows of the old industrial district, it catered to a very specific clientele. Men who spoke in hushed tones, who paid in cash, and who never stayed long enough to form friendships. Maria had learned the unspoken rules quickly. Serve the drinks, collect the money, and forget everything you see and hear. At 24, she was saving every dollar she could. Her mother's medical treatments weren't getting any cheaper, and the bills kept piling up like autumn leaves. The tips at the Golden Eagle were good, dangerously good. But Maria needed the money more than she feared the danger. She had a gift for becoming invisible, for moving through the bar like a ghost, noticed just long enough to deliver what was ordered and then forgotten the moment she turned away. But tonight was different. Tonight, Vincent Torino was holding court at table 7. Everyone knew who Vincent Torino was, even if they pretended they didn't. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in newspaper headlines, but never in court documents. The kind whose enemies had a habit of disappearing, and whose friends lived very, very well. He was in his 50s, with silver hair slicked back perfectly, and a face that had seen too much to ever look truly relaxed. His suits cost more than most people's cars, and his presence filled a room like expensive cologne, impossible to ignore. Torino had been coming to the Golden Eagle for the past 6 months, always on Thursday nights, always with the same 3 men. They occupied the corner table, the one with the best view of both exits, and they conducted their business in voices so low that even Maria, with her practiced eavesdropping skills, could never make out more than fragments. Real estate deals, they called them. Everyone knew better. Maria approached table 7 with the practiced confidence of someone who had learned to project calm, even when her heart was racing. In her 3 years at the bar, she had served drug dealers, loan sharks, and men who wore their violence like expensive watches. But Vincent Torino was different. He commanded respect not through intimidation, but through something far more dangerous. Absolute certainty that he was untouchable. As she set down his usual, a glass of 25-year-old scotch, no ice, Maria's eyes caught something that made her breath hitch. On Vincent's right hand, catching the amber light of the bar's dim fixtures, was a ring unlike anything she had ever seen. It was clearly old, crafted from white gold that had aged to a warm patina. The face bore an intricate design, a raven with outstretched wings, its eyes set with tiny rubies that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. But it was the band that made Maria's world tilt on its axis. Carved into the metal were symbols she recognized, symbols that had haunted her dreams since childhood. Her mother, Elena Santos, had worn an identical ring for as long as Maria could remember. It lived in a small jewelry box on her bedside table, too precious to wear, but too meaningful to store away completely. Elena had always been secretive about the ring's origins, claiming it was a family heirloom from her grandmother in Sicily. But whenever Maria asked for details, her mother's eyes would grow distant, and she would change the subject with the skill of someone who had practiced deflection for decades. The ring had fascinated Maria as a child. She would sneak into her mother's room and stare at it, tracing the carved symbols with her finger while Elena napped. The raven seemed to watch her, its ruby eyes holding secrets she was too young to understand. As she grew older, Maria had pressed her mother for the story behind it, but Elena remained stubbornly silent. It was just an old ring, she would insist. Nothing more. But seeing an identical ring on the hand of one of the city's most feared crime bosses changed everything. The symbols weren't random, decorative elements. They meant something. They connected her family to this world in ways that made Maria's blood run cold. Vincent noticed her hesitation immediately. His conversation with his associates stopped mid-sentence, and Maria felt the weight of 4 pairs of eyes settling on her like a physical presence. The bar around them seemed to fade into background noise, leaving only the pounding of her heart and the soft clink of ice in distant glasses. She should have walked away. Every instinct screamed at her to deliver the drink, collect the payment, and disappear back into the safety of anonymity. But the ring held her transfixed, and before her rational mind could stop her, the words tumbled out. "My mother has a ring just like yours." The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Vincent's hand, reaching for his glass, froze in mid-air. His eyes, which had been casually dismissive moments before, sharpened into laser focus. The 2 men flanking him, both built like former boxers with scars that told stories of violence, survived, tensed visibly. The 3rd man, younger and wearing wire-rimmed glasses that did nothing to soften his predatory smile, leaned forward with sudden interest. But it was Vincent's reaction that truly frightened Maria. His face didn't show anger or surprise. Instead, it displayed something far more unsettling: recognition. As if her words had confirmed something he had long suspected, something that both pleased and concerned him in equal measure. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Maria became acutely aware of how exposed she was, standing in the middle of the bar with nowhere to run and no one to help her. The other patrons had noticed the sudden tension and were studiously avoiding looking in their direction, a survival instinct honed by years of minding their own business in dangerous places. Vincent slowly lowered his hand to the table, his ring catching the light once more. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that came from never being questioned and never being wrong. "Your mother," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "Where exactly did she get this ring?" Maria's throat went dry as desert sand. The question hung in the air like smoke from Vincent's expensive cigarettes, thick and suffocating. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the bar's perpetual chill. This wasn't just curiosity. This was an interrogation. I don't know exactly," Maria stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She always said it was from her grandmother, from the old country. Vincent's eyes narrowed to slits. He lifted his hand, studying the ring as if seeing it for the first time in years. The rubies seemed to pulse in the dim light, like drops of blood frozen in time. "Sicily," he said. It wasn't a question. Maria nodded, unable to find her voice. How could he possibly know that? The man with the wire-rimmed glasses leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Boss," he said quietly, "maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private." But Vincent raised a hand, silencing him without breaking eye contact with Maria. "No, Tommy, this is exactly where it needs to happen." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Maria glanced around the bar, hoping someone, anyone, might intervene. But the other patrons had suddenly become very interested in their drinks, their conversations, anything that didn't involve the drama unfolding at table 7. Even Marco, the bartender who had hired her 3 years ago, was studiously polishing glasses with his back turned to them. With trembling legs, Maria sank into the chair. The leather was worn smooth by countless meetings, countless deals, countless conversations that probably ended badly for someone. She could smell Vincent's cologne now, something expensive and heavy that seemed to wrap around her like chains. "What's your mother's name?" Vincent asked, his voice deceptively gentle. Elena. Elena Santos. The name hit Vincent like a physical blow. Maria watched as his composed facade cracked, just for an instant. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened where they gripped the edge of the table, and something that might have been pain flashed across his features before disappearing behind his mask of control. Santos, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. And before she was married? What was her maiden name? Maria's mind raced. Why would he want to know that? And more importantly, why did she feel like her answer would determine whether she walked out of this bar alive? Rossini, she whispered. Elena Rossini. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Vincent's scotch glass shattered against the wall behind Maria's head, sending amber liquid and crystal shards cascading to the floor. She flinched, throwing her hands up to protect her face, but Vincent was already on his feet, towering over her like a storm cloud ready to break. "You're lying," he snarled, his careful composure finally cracking. "Elena Rossini is dead. She died in a fire 40 years ago. She's not dead," Maria shot back, fear transforming into desperate defiance. "She's in St. Mary's Hospital right now, fighting cancer, and I work in this God-forsaken place every night to pay for her treatments." The words echoed through the suddenly silent bar. Even the jukebox seemed to have stopped playing, as if the machine itself was holding its breath. Vincent stared down at Maria, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled emotion. For a moment, she thought he might strike her. Instead, he slowly sank back into his chair, his face pale as moonlight. "Show me," he said quietly. "What?" "The ring. I need to see your mother's ring." Maria's heart hammered against her ribs. "I don't have it with me. It's at home in her jewelry box." Vincent pulled out his phone, a sleek black device that probably cost more than Maria made in a month. He typed rapidly, his fingers steady despite the tremor she had noticed in his voice. Within seconds, his phone buzzed with a response. "My car will take you home," he announced. "You'll get the ring and you'll bring it back here, tonight. I can't just leave work." "Marco!" Vincent's voice cut through the air like a blade. The bartender appeared instantly, as if he had been waiting for the summons. "Miss Santos is done for the evening. Pay her for the full shift." Marco nodded rapidly, not daring to question the order. Maria realized with growing horror that Vincent Torino owned more than just this table. He owned the entire establishment, possibly the entire block. How had she been so naive? The man Vincent had called Tommy stood up, straightening his jacket with practiced efficiency. "I'll drive her," he said, but Vincent shook his head. "No, this is family business." He looked at Maria with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Isn't it, Maria?" The way he said her name made her skin crawl, like he had known it long before she had told him, like he had been waiting for this moment, this conversation, for years. A black sedan materialized outside the bar, as if summoned by magic. The driver, a mountain of a man in an expensive suit, held the door open without speaking. Maria found herself being escorted from the bar under the watchful eyes of every patron, all of whom suddenly seemed far more interested in her exit than they had been in her presence. The ride to her apartment was conducted in suffocating silence. Maria sat in the back seat, hyper-aware of the driver's eyes watching her in the rearview mirror. The city rushed past in streaks of neon and shadow, familiar streets transformed into alien landscapes by her fear and confusion. Her apartment building looked different somehow, smaller and more vulnerable than it had that morning. As she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her door, Maria's mind raced with questions that had no good answers. How did Vincent know her mother? Why did he think Elena was dead? And most terrifyingly, what would happen when he saw that second ring? Elena's jewelry box sat exactly where it always had, on the small table beside her bed. The box itself was nothing special, just carved wood worn smooth by decades of handling. But inside, nestled in faded velvet, was the ring that had haunted Maria's childhood dreams. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. In the harsh light of her apartment, the similarities to Vincent's ring were even more pronounced. The raven, the rubies, the intricate symbols carved into the band. But there were differences too. Subtle variations that suggested they had been crafted by the same hand, but for different purposes. As Maria turned the ring over in her fingers, she noticed something she had never seen before. On the inside of the band, worn almost smooth by time, were tiny letters. She squinted, holding the ring up to the light, trying to make them out. VTER, sempre, always. The Italian word for always. Vincent Torino, Elena Rossini, always. The ring slipped from Maria's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She stared at it in horror as the pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed began falling into place. Her mother's secretiveness, her refusal to talk about the past, her fear whenever Maria mentioned working at the Golden Eagle. Elena Rossini hadn't died in a fire 40 years ago. She had simply disappeared, taking a new name and a new life, leaving behind everything and everyone she had ever known, including, apparently, Vincent Torino. Maria's hands shook as she retrieved the ring and slipped it into her pocket. Outside, the black sedan waited like a patient predator, its engine purring softly in the night air. She had no choice but to return to the bar, to face Vincent with this revelation that would change everything. But as she walked back down those stairs, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking towards something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The ring in her pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric, a brand that marked her as part of a story she was only beginning to understand. The bar looked different when she returned, transformed by knowledge into something far more sinister than a simple criminal hangout. This wasn't just where Vincent conducted business. This was where he had been waiting, perhaps for years, for someone to walk in wearing Elena Rossini's face and carrying Elena Rossini's secrets. Vincent looked up as she entered, his eyes immediately drawn to her pocket where the ring waited like a loaded gun. The other patrons had cleared out, leaving only Vincent, his 3 associates, and Marco behind the bar. The stage was set for whatever revelation was about to unfold. "Did you find it?" Vincent asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Maria nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the ring one last time before everything changed forever. Maria pulled the ring from her pocket, the metal catching the bar's amber light like captured fire. She placed it on the scarred wooden table between them, and Vincent Torino's world tilted on its axis. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the entire city had stopped breathing. Vincent reached for the ring with trembling fingers, a gesture so uncharacteristic that his associates exchanged worried glances. The man who had built an empire on unwavering control was visibly shaking as he lifted Elena's ring to the light. His own ring seemed to pulse in response. 2 pieces of a puzzle that had been separated for 4 decades finally reunited. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of buried pain. Maria watched as Vincent examined every detail with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a priceless diamond. His thumb traced the carved symbols, the raven's outstretched wings, the tiny rubies that seemed to hold secrets in their depths. When he turned the ring over and saw the inscription on the inside, his composure finally shattered completely. A sound escaped his throat, something between a sob and a growl of anguish. The sound of a man who had spent 40 years believing the love of his life was dead, only to discover she had been living a few miles away under a different name. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably, unused to seeing their boss display any emotion beyond cold calculation. "You said she was in the hospital," Vincent said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "St. Mary's?" Maria nodded, fear and fascination warring in her chest. She was watching a transformation, seeing the feared crime boss stripped down to reveal someone entirely different underneath. Someone who had loved her mother with an intensity that 40 years of separation couldn't diminish. Vincent stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Tommy, get the car," Now, he turned to Maria, his eyes wild with desperate hope and barely contained fury. "You're coming with me. I don't understand what's happening," Maria protested, though she was already reaching for her jacket. Some instinct told her that resistance was futile, that forces larger than her understanding were now in motion. "Your mother," Vincent said, pocketing both rings with reverent care, "was supposed to be my wife." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She stared at Vincent, searching his face for signs of deception, but found only raw honesty that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier threats. Her mother, the gentle woman who made rosary beads and worried about Maria's safety, had once been engaged to marry one of the most dangerous men in the city. The ride to St. Mary's Hospital passed in a blur of neon lights and racing thoughts. Vincent sat beside Maria in the back seat, his usual predatory stillness replaced by nervous energy that made the air in the car feel electric. His fingers drummed against his knee in a rhythm that Maria somehow recognized, though she couldn't place where she had heard it before. "Tell me about her," Vincent said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. "Tell me about Elena." Maria found herself talking, describing her mother's quiet strength, her devotion to her faith, her fear of storms, and her love of old movies. With each detail, Vincent's face grew softer, years of hardness melting away to reveal glimpses of the young man he must have been before power and violence had carved him into something else entirely. "She still hums when she cooks," Maria said without thinking. "Always the same song, but I never knew what it was." Vincent's breath caught. He began to hum, a haunting Italian melody that Maria had heard countless times echoing from her mother's kitchen. The sound of it in Vincent's deep voice made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. "It was our song," he said quietly. "We danced to it the night I asked her to marry me." St. Mary's Hospital loomed before them like a monument to suffering, its windows glowing yellow against the dark sky. Maria had walked through those doors hundreds of times over the past 2 years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she was bringing her mother's past back to claim her. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was excruciating. Vincent stood rigid beside her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Maria could practically feel the waves of tension radiating from him. Whatever had happened between him and her mother 40 years ago had left scars that had never properly healed. Elena's room was at the end of the hallway, past the nurse's station, where Maria was known by name. The night shift supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, looked up with surprise as they approached. "Maria, honey, visiting hours ended at 9. And who's this gentleman?" Vincent stepped forward, and Maria watched Mrs. Patterson's expression change from mild concern to something approaching fear. There was something about Vincent that commanded immediate attention, an aura of danger that civilian instincts recognized, even when the mind couldn't explain why. "I'm an old friend of Elena's," Vincent said smoothly, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "I've just learned about her condition. I hope you'll make an exception." Mrs. Patterson nodded quickly, stepping aside without another word. Maria realized that Vincent's influence extended even here, into this sterile world of healing and hope. Nothing in the city was beyond his reach. They paused outside room 427, and Maria felt Vincent's resolve waver. Through the small window in the door, they could see Elena sleeping, her face pale and drawn from months of chemotherapy. The machines surrounding her bed beeped softly, a mechanical lullaby that had become the soundtrack of Maria's fears. "She looks so small," Vincent whispered, and Maria heard 40 years of regret in those 4 words. Elena stirred as they entered, her eyes opening slowly. Maria watched her mother's face change as she focused on the figure beside her hospital bed. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like terror mixed with desperate joy. "Vincent?" Elena's voice was barely audible, a ghost of the vibrant woman Maria remembered from her childhood. "You're not real. I'm dreaming again." Vincent sank into the visitor's chair, his powerful frame suddenly seeming fragile. "I'm real, Elena. I'm here." Elena's hand, thin and marked with IV lines, reached toward him with trembling fingers. Vincent caught it carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. The sight of their joined hands, his still bearing the ring that marked him as one of the city's most feared men, hers bearing the faded tan line where her own ring had rested for decades, broke something open in Maria's chest. "I thought you were dead," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "They told me you were dead, in the fire. They showed me pictures." "What fire?" Vincent's voice was sharp with sudden alertness. "Elena, what fire?" Maria watched her mother's face crumple as memories she had spent 40 years suppressing came flooding back. The story that emerged, told in fragments between tears and labored breathing, painted a picture of betrayal that made Maria's blood run cold. Elena had been 18 when she met Vincent, the daughter of a small-time bookmaker who ran numbers for the Torino family. Vincent was 22, already being groomed to take over from his father, but still young enough to believe in love over loyalty. Their courtship had been a secret thing, hidden from both families who would have seen it as weakness. But secrets in their world were currency, and someone had been collecting. Elena's own father, desperate to pay off gambling debts that would have cost him his life, had made a deal with the Torino family's rivals. Information about Vincent's movements, his weaknesses, his plans, and most valuable of all, information about the girl who had captured his heart. The fire had been real, but it wasn't Vincent who had died in it. It was Elena's apartment building, and she was supposed to have been inside when it happened. Instead, she had been pulled from her bed in the middle of the night by men who told her Vincent was dead, that his enemies had killed him, and that she would be next unless she disappeared completely. They had given her a new identity, a new life in a different part of the city, and strict instructions never to try to contact anyone from her past. For her own safety, they said, for Vincent's memory. The ring was all she had been allowed to keep, a secret she had guarded for 4 decades. "Who?" Vincent's voice cut through Elena's tears like a blade. "Who told you I was dead?" Elena's eyes darted to Maria, then back to Vincent. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "Your brother," she whispered. "Salvatore told me you were dead." The name hit Vincent like a physical blow. He released Elena's hand and stood abruptly, his face transforming back into the mask of cold fury that Maria had first seen in the bar. Salvatore Torino, Vincent's younger brother, the one person Vincent had trusted above all others. "Sal's been dead for 30 years, Vincent said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Car accident in 1993. Elena shook her head weakly. "He visits me every year on the anniversary of the fire. He brings flowers and reminds me what happens to people who talk about the past." The revelation hung in the air like poison gas. Maria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized the scope of the deception that had shaped her entire life. Her mother hadn't just been hiding from a dangerous past. She had been held prisoner by it, threatened into silence by a man who was supposed to be dead. Vincent pulled out his phone with mechanical precision, his fingers flying over the screen. Within moments, he was barking orders to whoever answered. "I want everything we have on Salvatore's death. Every photo, every report, every witness statement. I want it now." He paused, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "And I want surveillance on every cemetery in the city. Someone's been visiting graves, and I want to know who." As Vincent orchestrated his investigation from Elena's bedside, Maria found herself studying her mother with new eyes. The woman she had thought she knew was a stranger, someone who had lived an entire secret life filled with love and terror and sacrifice. The gentle Catholic widow was also Elena Rossini, who had loved a gangster and paid the price for 40 years. "Mom," Maria said softly, taking her mother's other hand, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Elena's eyes, still bright despite her illness, focused on her daughter with fierce intensity. "Because some stories are too dangerous to tell. Because I wanted you to have a different life than the one I chose. But you didn't choose it," Maria protested. "They forced you into hiding. I chose to love him," Elena replied, her gaze shifting to Vincent, who had finished his phone call and was watching them with an expression Maria couldn't read. I chose to wear his ring, to plan a future with him. In that world, love is always a choice that comes with consequences. Vincent approached the bed again, his phone now silent in his hand. The machinery of his organization was already in motion, hunting for answers that had been hidden for 4 decades. But for now, in this sterile hospital room, he was just a man confronting the love he thought he had lost. "Elena," he said, his voice gentle again, "I'm going to make this right. Whoever did this, whoever kept us apart, they're going to pay." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her gaunt face into something beautiful. "Don't you understand, Vincent? They already have paid. They stole 40 years from us, yes, but they couldn't steal everything." She looked at Maria, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The timing of Maria's birth, the way Elena had always refused to discuss her father, the reason she had been so afraid when Maria started working at the Golden Eagle. "She's yours," Elena whispered to Vincent. "Maria is your daughter." The words echoed in the small hospital room like gunshots. Maria felt the world tilt around her as she stared from her mother to the man who had been a stranger an hour ago and was now revealed as the father she had never known. Vincent's face went through a series of rapid changes: shock, disbelief, wonder, and finally, a fierce, protective love that transformed him completely. He sank back into the chair, his eyes never leaving Maria's face as he searched for familiar features, for proof of the connection Elena had just revealed. Maria found herself doing the same, seeing her own dark eyes reflected in his, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw in his profile. "All these years," Vincent said, his voice breaking, "all these years, I had a daughter." The implications crashed over Maria like a wave. Her father wasn't some faceless man who had abandoned them. He was Vincent Torino, one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city. The blood running through her veins carried the legacy of generations of criminals and kings of the underworld. But more than that, she was the living proof that love had existed between Vincent and Elena, that their story hadn't ended with betrayal and loss. She was the secret that Salvatore had tried to bury, the evidence that his deception hadn't been complete. And so a single sentence spoken in a smoky bar unraveled 40 years of deception, reuniting a father and daughter who never knew each other existed. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, proving that even the most carefully buried secrets can't stay hidden forever. What started as a chance encounter between a waitress and a crime boss became a story of love, betrayal, and family bonds that no amount of time or deception could truly destroy.